Lord have mercy. Good evening. Tonight we're going to talk about trauma and what makes a person, otherwise known as Truth of the Divine by Lindsay Ellis, the sequel to Axiom's End. Now, I really have no idea how I'm going to talk about this book because similarly to Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, this is a book that yes, is well written, yes, is interesting to read, yes, I'm glad I read it, but did I enjoy it? Who's to say? We'll unpack that as we go on. If you're unfamiliar with this story, in 2020, Axiom End by Lindsay Ellis was released. Lindsay Ellis is a writer, video essayist, YouTuber, author, best-selling author, and this is a first contact story. You have the main character, Cora Sabino, who unintentionally, inadvertently, becomes one of the only people on the planet who can communicate with an alien species that has come to Earth seeking refuge. And the events of Truth of the Divine take place only a couple months after the events of Axiom's End. I'm going to do my best to explain my feelings and thoughts and about this book without giving any spoilers, so I apologize for some vague language, but this book is definitely something to be reckoned with. So first and foremost, you can tell this is a sequel, and I mean that in a good way and a bad way. The good way is that the writing is definitely better than Axiom's End. I haven't spent much time researching Lindsay's writing process or watching any interviews about her process with writing this book. I can just say that this felt tighter, cleaner, more consistent. There were just more moments where I was like, damn, like that actual sentence or those, that turn of phrase really struck me, as opposed to the first book where I was more engaged by the events of the novel and less the actual craft of writing. The downside about it being a sequel is that I know based on some press releases that Axiom's End, Truth of the Divine, the Numena series, is going to have multiple books, assuming each one sells well. And I feel like you can tell that this is an in-between book. Yes, there is a main villain antagonist. Yes, there are multiple characters who you learn more about. You get some resolution, you get some answers to questions we were asking in the first book. But it does, to me, feel very much like a setup, especially with the way it ends. You're kind of left with this question of, oh shit, to be specific. And while I totally understand kind of ending on not so much a cliffhanger, but whatever that is, nonverbals, it makes you want to read the next book. But I can't help but feeling that whatever the third book is in this series, I'm going to like more, simply because it's going to get more at the kind of meat and potatoes of not only Cora and Ampersand's relationship, but what is actually going to happen within the lifetime of these characters. And the reason I say within the lifetime, I'm trying to stick to within the lifetime of these characters is because when you're talking about intergalactic conversation, different species, space travel, the bending of time and space, there are a lot of threats that come out in these series that seem a bit distant, a bit far off, something that, might keep you awake at night, but things you most likely won't have to handle in your lifetime. And this book definitely picks up the pace on those pressing outside forces. In addition, this book at the end puts Cora and Ampersand in a position where they have the power, the ability to make a decision that will affect literally the existence of humanity moving forward. And that sounds incredibly huge, but the way it is brought up feels so simple and natural that it kind of baffles the mind at the juxtaposition. And again, I'm sorry for being vague, but I don't want to give any spoilers. Another thing you should definitely know about this book is the beginning of it has a content warning. Now, I read the first two sentences of the content warning, and in those two sentences, Lindsay mentioned that the content warning will involve some spoilers. So I didn't read it, and that was my individual choice. Whether or not you read it may affect your relationship with the book, but I was glad and also not glad I read it. You can see how ambivalent I am about this book, because on one hand, each individual scene that involved emotional trauma, that involved, a massive gut punch, that involved a very intense moment of violence or conflict, felt very intense because I didn't always know it was coming. But at the same time, as I mentioned in my last video, I think it was Terrible Books for Terrible Times, I'm not in the greatest place right now, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, psychically. So reading about suicidal ideation and self-harm and panic attacks was a choice. It was a choice I made, and I chose not to read the spoilers. The spoilers within the content warning. So if you pick up this book, know that it is not a light read. And I think that was the hardest thing actually for me to handle about this book. Axiom's End, yes, there's danger. Yes, there's drama. Yes, there's family conflict and violence and, evisceration and all these things and death. But this is fun. Like, to me, this felt like an action sci-fi movie with some like heavy drama thrown in, some grounded characters. And I had such a good time reading it. This was not fun. It was better. Like, I would say in every form of craft, this is a better book. But it was not an enjoyable read. Do I think it was realistic in the way it portrayed trauma and the way the conversations around who and what is a human played out on a government and local and interpersonal relationship? Do I think that the way it talked about far-right groups and the way fear can just infect individuals and lead them to do not only illegal but unethical things to quell that fear? All of that felt realistic. I mean, one of my biggest pet peeves in long-running TV shows or movie series is something life-altering happening to the main characters, and then 3 weeks later, it's like, remember that time I was kidnapped by a terrorist? Like, it just, they act like it has no effect on them. This entire book is really Cora and Ampersand and a little bit of her mother, and even Nils, the whistleblower, Cora's absentee father, in his own way, reckoning with what happened in the first book. And I think that Lindsay does a really great job of making that feel realistic and grounded, not just in the individuals, but also in the politics, the way the political response, the media response plays out to the knowledge that not only aliens exist, but they have very specific abilities and powers, and each of them have their own intent. I mentioned in my review of Axiom's End that I hope that this book would focus more on the aliens and less on the people, and I kind of didn't get my wish. There's a new character named Kaveh, who is a journalist who was introduced into this book and takes up a main chunk of it, has this blossoming relationship with Cora, and Cora's relationship with Kaveh versus her relationship with Ampersand is juxtaposed in really interesting ways. And yet I wasn't annoyed that I got less world building in terms of individual aliens because another alien is introduced. And I don't want to give too much away in that, but you do meet someone else, another alien with a different backstory, different personality, their own unique connection to Ampersand and Cora and Kaveh. And for some reason, the introduction of these two other characters who become main characters through this book balance themselves out. And I felt like I was getting everything that I wanted in terms of more information about alien physiology and what they're capable of and what their goals are and how their various relationships and bonding work, in addition to learning about this new human character. This human character, frankly, who I enjoyed more than Cora. Is that really fair, considering what Cora's going through doesn't necessarily make her a fun person to read about? Who's to say? But Kaveh is someone who I really enjoyed learning about and seeing the different ways he interacted with the aliens. Because in the first book, we're really only getting Cora's perspective and Cora's explanation of what makes people and culture and why the internet has so much sex. Like, those are things that we're only getting from Cora's perspective. So to almost have like I don't want to say a rehashing because I think that's a bit insulting, but a new version of the first contact story with this journalist who ends up wrapped up in Cora's life and in this situation and forming his own independent relationship with an alien. I really did enjoy that. So I wanted to acknowledge that I was kind of wrong about what I said last year. And I do actually like learning more about the humans as long as it's always in relationship to the aliens. Another thing I wanted to mention about this book is as I was reading it, it felt more adult to me. And I don't mean that in sense of like specific Barnes and Noble genres. I'm not trying to argue that these books are adult or young adult or new adult or whatever. It's just that this book, due to the content in regards to mental health and physical health, is a lot darker. There also is a lot more violence, not only between aliens and humans, but also humans and aliens, which are my favorite fight scenes. In addition, this book has a sexual relationship in it, multiple sexual relationships, depending on how you define sexual. So that as well, I think, is just something to note. I have no idea if what the average age of the people who watch my channel is. I haven't looked at that in a while. And even then, age does not necessarily correlate to what type of content you want in your books. But just know that if you read Axiom's End and enjoyed it, Truth of the Divine is not only darker in tone, darker in subject matter, it also has more violence, it has more death, it has more profanity, and it has more sex, sexual thoughts, sexual actions, etc. So something to note. And speaking of the whole concept of what makes a person, that is a through line throughout this story. Different people give different definitions of personhood, and different people give different justifications for what makes a person, and how individuals who are not from this planet, not from this universe even, should interact with the US government in rights to personhood, in regard to their personhood. And that may seem really dry and philosophical, but I found all the conversations really, really fascinating. Because as you quickly learn, some of the arguments that people make in this book for why Ampersand and his other, symphiles and other aliens should not be considered people with particular rights and protections under the United States could very, very easily and quickly be applied to people who are naturally smarter than others, naturally stronger, have certain abilities or disabilities, speak different languages. You can clearly see how slippery that slope can be. And as someone who could not give a succinct, very clear, specific, non-exploitable definition of what a person is, of who a person is, it was really, really interesting to me on like a philosophical level to watch all these different individuals navigate who they define as a person, and therefore what type of rights that person should get. And since this is a book of fiction, you're getting some of the backstory of these individuals, and you can see how fear, how their prior experiences, how their identities, whether it's their gender or their sexual orientation or their race, affects their idea of who and what is a person. And a lot of those conversations reminded me of like science fiction books I read when I was younger that often involve clones. Like I find the whole concept of human clones and what kind of rights do they have, and do they count as independent people, and what does it mean to have two people who with identical DNA living in a society. I loved all those books. I love those movies like The Island that talk about those concepts. So to have that similar personhood conversation woven in with all of this violence and trauma and science fiction adventure was really, really fascinating to me, especially because the new alien you're introduced to, who frankly is my favorite, who when you're first introduced to them goes by Enola, you get to see more of the distinct personalities of these individual aliens and how they come to make the decisions that they have made, even coming from the same culture, being the same species, being, in some cases, even symphiles, being bonded together in a very, very deep personal way, how they're interacting with the world and interpreting human culture and human language and human nature in their own distinct fashion. So I feel like anything else I could say about this book would be diving into spoilers. So TLDR, I think this book is well written. I definitely think it is an improvement from the first one, and I can clearly tell that Lindsay is getting better at her craft. The downsides is that it's very heavy, very dark, very specific, and I would say realistic in terms of mental health and trauma. So if you're someone who's struggling with that right now, or if you're someone who just doesn't like to read that in your books, I would stay away from this. And that kind of bummed me out a little bit, because even though it makes logical sense to me in terms of the arc of the story, this book wasn't nearly as fun to read as the first one. And while I'm not someone who only looks to books for entertainment, and there are definitely movies and TV shows that lean on the darker, that lean on the more psychological that I enjoy, I just really wasn't expecting that based off what we got in the first Axiom's End. I will say that I think this book has set up the third book very well, because the entire last fourth talks about this question of not only what makes a person, but what makes human society valuable. Why should we exist? And not necessarily in a like, oh, what do we contribute to the universe and to the world? Because frankly, nothing. At least that's my bias. But what makes us who we are? And is life on Earth, is being on Earth the only time and place and environment in which we can truly be ourselves? What does it mean to be humans without culture, or humans without home, or humans without an idea of our history? I loved that. I loved all those conversations. And I think this is definitely a book that you can have really interesting conversations with other people on. Will I read the third book? Most likely, but mainly out of curiosity and less out of investment in these characters. I now have my new favorite character, who at the beginning of the book, so I'm just going to call them by that name, goes by Enola. So I definitely want to see how they evolve and how their relationship with humans and human society changes. I definitely want to learn more about the choices that Cora and Ampersand have to make that affect billions of people beyond them. And I'm just going to leave it at that. And I very much want to know what happens. I just feel like now I'm kind of bracing myself for what's going to come next, because this is not the fun adventure sci-fi romp I feel like I was promised from the first book. But there's supposed to be, I think, like 4 or 5. So who knows how the tone is going to change and how it's going to advance. And also, I was under the assumption, for no particular reason, that all of these books will be set on Earth. But the way that the second book ended, I think it is highly possible that there will be multiple settings besides this lovely blue and green planet, which piques my interest even further. So again, here's a perfect example of why I do not rate books, because I would not know how to rate this. I would not know how to rate a book that I think is well written and realistic and delves into characters in a really grounded, interesting way, but at the same time was hard to read and was hard to get through and definitely took its own toll. And I had to kind of take my time working through it just to protect my own mental health. I will most likely read the third one, but I don't think I will necessarily pre-order the third one, which is what I did with this. So I'm invested, but not as much as I previously was. This probably was a very unhelpful review, but if you got even a smidgen of useful information out of it, you're welcome. I hope it helps. And I hope you do let me know what you think if you choose to read it. Axiom's End by Lindsay Ellis. And as always, have a good one. Bye.